a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Dick Cheney. Richard Bruce Cheney is an American politician and businessman who served as the 46th Vice President of the United States from 2001 to 2009. Born in Lincoln, Nebraska, Cheney was primarily raised in Sumner, Nebraska, and Casper, Wyoming. He attended Yale and then the University of Wyoming, at the latter of which he earned a BA and an MA in political science. He began his political career as an intern for Congressman William A. Steiger, eventually working his way into the White House during the Nixon and Ford administrations, where he later served as the White House Chief of Staff from 1975 to 1977. In 1978, Cheney was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives representing Wyoming's at-large congressional district from 1979 to 1989. He was re-elected 5 times, briefly serving as House Minority Whip in 1989. Cheney was selected to be the Secretary of Defense during the presidency of George H. W. Bush, holding the position for the majority of Bush's term from 1989 to 1993. During his time in the Department of Defense, Cheney oversaw the 1991 Operation Desert Storm, among other actions. Out of office during the Clinton administration, Cheney was the chairman and CEO of Halliburton Company from 1995 to 2000. In July 2000, Cheney was chosen by presumptive Republican presidential nominee George W. Bush as his running mate in the 2000 presidential election. They defeated their Democratic opponents, incumbent Vice President Al Gore and Senator Joe Lieberman. In 2004, Cheney was re-elected to his second term as vice president, defeating Senator John Kerry's running mate, Senator John Edwards. During Cheney's tenure as vice president, he played a leading behind-the-scenes role in the George W. Bush administration's response to the September 11 attacks and coordination of the global war on terrorism. He was an early proponent of Operation Iraqi Freedom and defender of the administration's anti-terrorism record. He became at odds with President Bush's position against same-sex marriage in 2004. Cheney was often criticized for the Bush administration's policies regarding the campaign against terrorism, wiretapping by the National Security Agency, and so-called enhanced interrogation techniques. In 2011, Cheney published his memoir In My Time, a personal and political memoir, written with daughter Liz Cheney, and in 2015, published another book, Exceptional: Why the World Needs a Powerful America, again co-authored with his daughter. He has been cited as the most powerful vice president in American history. At the same time, he has been among the least favored politicians in the history of the United States. His approval rating when leaving office was only 13%. Early life and education. Cheney was born in Lincoln, Nebraska, the son of Marjorie Lorraine and Richard Herbert Cheney. He is of predominantly English, as well as Welsh, Irish, and French Huguenot ancestry. Cheney's 8th great-grandfather, William Cheney, immigrated from England to Massachusetts in the 17th century. Although not a direct descendant, he is collaterally related to Benjamin Pierce Cheney, the early American expressman. Cheney is a very distant cousin of both Harry S. Truman and Barack Obama. The three share a common ancestor in Maureen Duval, a Huguenot who fled from France to England in the 17th century and later settled in Maryland. His father was a soil conservation agent for the U.S. Department of Agriculture and his mother was a softball star in the 1930s. Cheney was one of 3 children. He attended Calvert Elementary School before his family moved to Casper, Wyoming, where he attended Natrona County High School. He attended Yale University, but by his own account had problems adjusting to the college, and failed out twice. Among the influential teachers from his days in New Haven was Professor H. Bradford Westerfield, whom Cheney repeatedly credited with having helped to shape his approach to foreign policy. He later attended the University of Wyoming, where he earned both a Bachelor of Arts and a Master of Arts in Political Science. He subsequently started, but did not finish, doctoral studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. In November 1962, at the age of 21, Cheney was convicted of driving while intoxicated. He was arrested for DWI again the following year. Cheney said that the arrests made him think about where I was and where I was headed. I was headed down a bad road if I continued on that course. In 1964, he married Lynn Vincent, his high school sweetheart, whom he had met at age 14. When Cheney became eligible for the draft during the Vietnam War, he applied for and received 5 draft deferments. In 1989, The Washington Post writer George C. Wilson interviewed Cheney as the next Secretary of Defense. When asked about his deferments, Cheney reportedly said, "I had other priorities in the 60s than military service." Cheney testified during his confirmation hearings in 1989 that he received deferments to finish a college career that lasted 6 years rather than 4, owing to subpar academic performance and the need to work to pay for his education. Initially, Cheney was not drafted due to his marriage to Lynn Cheney. When the draft was expanded to include married men without children, he applied for 4 deferments in sequence. He applied for his 5th exemption on January 19, 1966, when his wife was about 10 weeks pregnant. He was granted 3 status, the hardship exemption, which excluded men with children or dependent parents. In January 1967, Cheney turned 26 and was no longer eligible for the draft. Early White House appointments. Cheney's political career began in 1969 as an intern for Congressman William A. Steiger during the Richard Nixon administration. He then joined the staff of Donald Rumsfeld, who was then director of the Office of Economic Opportunity from 1969 to 1970. He held several positions in the years that followed: White House Staff Assistant in 1971, Assistant Director of the Cost of Living Council from 1971 to 1973, and Deputy Assistant to the President from 1974 to 1975. As Deputy Assistant, Cheney suggested several options in a memo to Rumsfeld, including use of the U.S. Justice Department that the Ford administration could use to limit damage from an article published by the New York Times, in which investigative reporter Seymour Hersh reported that Navy submarines had tapped into Soviet undersea communications as part of a highly classified program, Operation Ivy Bells. Cheney was assistant to the President and White House Deputy Chief of Staff under Gerald Ford. When Rumsfeld was named Secretary of Defense, Cheney became White House Chief of Staff, succeeding Rumsfeld. He later was campaign manager for Ford's 1976 presidential campaign. Elections. In 1978, Cheney was elected to represent Wyoming in the U.S. House of Representatives and succeeded retiring Democratic Congressman Tenno Roncalio, having defeated his Democratic opponent, Bill Bailey. Cheney was re-elected 5 times, serving until 1989. Leadership. In 1987, he was elected chairman of the House Republican Conference. The following year, he was elected House Minority Whip. He served for 2.5 months before he was appointed Secretary of Defense instead of former U.S. Senator John G. Tower, whose nomination had been rejected by the U.S. Senate in March 1989. Votes. He voted against the creation of the U.S. Department of Education, citing his concern over budget deficits and expansion of the federal government, and claiming that the department was an encroachment on states' rights. He voted against funding Head Start, but reversed his position in 2000. Cheney initially voted in 1978 against establishing a national holiday in honor of Martin Luther King Jr., but supported creation of the holiday 5 years later in 1983. Cheney supported Bob Michel's bid to become Republican minority leader. In April 1980, Cheney endorsed Governor Ronald Reagan for president, becoming one of Reagan's earliest supporters. After the resignation of James G. Watt as Interior Secretary in 1983, Cheney was a top candidate to succeed him, but Reagan appointed William Clark instead. In 1986, after President Ronald Reagan vetoed a bill to impose economic sanctions on South Africa for its policy of apartheid, Cheney was one of 83 representatives to vote against overriding Reagan's veto. In later years, he articulated his opposition to unilateral sanctions against many different countries, stating, they almost never work, and that in that case they might have ended up hurting the people instead. In 1986, Cheney, along with 145 Republicans and 31 Democrats, voted against a non-binding congressional resolution calling on the South African government to release Nelson Mandela from prison. After the Democrats defeated proposed amendments that would have required Mandela to renounce violence sponsored by the African National Congress and requiring it to oust the communist faction from its leadership, the resolution was defeated. Appearing on CNN, Cheney addressed criticism for this, saying he opposed the resolution because the ANC at the time was viewed as a terrorist organization and had a number of interests that were fundamentally inimical to the United States. The federal building in Casper, a regional center of the fossil fuel industry, is named the Dick Cheney Federal Building. Committee assignments. Originally declining, U.S. Congressman Barbara Conable persuaded Cheney to join the moderate Republican Wednesday group in order to move up the leadership ranks. He was elected chairman of the Republican Policy Committee from 1981 to 1987. Cheney was the ranking member of the Select Committee to investigate the Iran-Contra affair. He promoted Wyoming's petroleum and coal businesses as well. Secretary of Defense 1989-1993. President George H. W. Bush nominated Cheney for the office of Secretary of Defense immediately after the U.S. Senate failed to confirm John Tower for that position. The Senate confirmed Cheney by a vote of 92-0, and he served in that office from March 1989 to January 1993. He directed the United States invasion of Panama and Operation Desert Storm in the Middle East. In 1991, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Bush. Later that year, he received the U.S. Senator John Heinz Award for Greatest Public Service by an elected or appointed official, an award given out annually by Jefferson Awards. Cheney has said his time at the Pentagon was the most rewarding period of his public service career, calling it the one that stands out. In 2014, Cheney recounted that when he met with President George H. W. Bush to accept the offer, he passed a painting in a private residence entitled The Peacemakers, which depicted President Lincoln, General Grant, and William Tecumseh Sherman. "My great-grandfather had served under William Tecumseh Sherman throughout the war," Cheney said. "And it occurred to me as I was in the room as I walked in to talk to the president about becoming Secretary of Defense. I wondered what he would have thought that his great-grandson would someday be in the White House with the president talking about taking over the reins of the U.S. military." Early tenure. Cheney worked closely with Pete Williams, Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, and Paul Wolfowitz, Under Secretary of Defense for Policy, from the beginning of his tenure. He focused primarily on external matters, and left most of the internal DoD management to Deputy Secretary of Defense Donald Atwood. Budgetary practices. Cheney's most immediate issue as Secretary of Defense was the Department of Defense budget. Cheney deemed it appropriate to cut the budget and downsize the military. Following the Reagan administration's peacetime defense buildup at the height of the Cold War, as part of the fiscal year 1990 budget, Cheney assessed the requests from each of the branches of the armed services for such expensive programs as the Avenger II naval attack aircraft, the B-2 stealth bomber, the V-22 Osprey tilt-wing helicopter, the Aegis destroyer and the MX missile, totaling approximately $4.5 billion in light of changed world politics. Cheney opposed the V-22 program, which Congress had already appropriated funds for, and initially refused to issue contracts for it before relenting. When the 1990 budget came before Congress in the summer of 1989, it settled on a figure between the administration's request and the House Armed Services Committee's recommendation. In subsequent years under Cheney, the proposed and adopted budgets followed patterns similar to that of 1990. Early in 1991, he unveiled a plan to reduce military strength by the mid-1990s to 1.6 million, compared with 2.2 million when he entered office. Cheney's 1993 defense budget was reduced from 1992 omitting programs that Congress had directed the Department of Defense to buy weapons that it did not want, and omitting unrequested reserve forces. Over his 4 years as Secretary of Defense, Cheney downsized the military and his budgets showed negative real growth, despite pressures to acquire weapon systems advocated by Congress. The Department of Defense's total obligational authority in current dollars declined from $291 billion to $270 billion. Total military personnel strength decreased by 19%, from about 2.2 million in 1989 to about 1.8 million in 1993. Notwithstanding the overall reduction in military spending, Cheney directed the development of a Pentagon plan to ensure U.S. military dominance in the post-Cold War era. Political climate and agenda. Cheney publicly expressed concern that nations such as Iraq, Iran, and North Korea could acquire nuclear components after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the disintegration of the Warsaw Pact obliged the first Bush administration to re-evaluate the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's purpose and makeup. Cheney believed that NATO should remain the foundation of European security relationships and that it would remain important to the United States in the long term. He urged the alliance to lend more assistance to the new democracies in Eastern Europe. Cheney's views on NATO reflected his skepticism about prospects for peaceful social development in the former Eastern Bloc countries, where he saw a high potential for political uncertainty and instability. He felt that the Bush administration was too optimistic in supporting General Secretary of the CPSU Mikhail Gorbachev and his successor, Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Cheney worked to maintain strong ties between the United States and its European allies. Cheney persuaded the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia to allow bases for U.S. ground troops and warplanes in the nation. This was an important element of the success of the Gulf War, as well as a lightning rod for Islamists, such as Osama bin Laden, who opposed having non-Muslim armies near their holy sites. International situations. Using economic sanctions and political pressure, the United States mounted a campaign to drive Panamanian ruler General Manuel Antonio Noriega from power after he fell from favor in May 1989. After Guillermo Endara had been duly elected president of Panama, Noriega nullified the election outcome, drawing intensified pressure. In October, Noriega suppressed a military coup, but in December, after soldiers of the Panamanian army killed a U.S. serviceman, the United States invasion of Panama began under Cheney's direction. The stated reason for the invasion was to seize Noriega to face drug charges in the United States, protect U.S. lives and property, and restore Panamanian civil liberties. Although the mission was controversial, U.S. forces achieved control of Panama and Endara assumed the presidency. Noriega was convicted and imprisoned on racketeering and drug trafficking charges in April 1992. In 1991, the Somali Civil War drew the world's attention. In August 1992, the United States began to provide humanitarian assistance, primarily food, through a military airlift. At President Bush's direction, Cheney dispatched the first of 26,000 U.S. troops to Somalia as part of the Unified Task Force, designed to provide security and food relief. Cheney's successors as Secretary of Defense, Leigh Aspin and William J. Perry, had to contend with both the Bosnian and Somali issues. Brought to you by WikiVidi Documentaries. Would you like to know more?